When you hear the phrase indie animation, the first thing you probably think of is Murder Jones or the amazing digital Circus, which are both owned by Glitch Productions, an indie studio based in Australia, known for making some of the most popular shows in the indie animation community, like the already mentioned Murder Jones and the amazing digital Circus, as well as the Gaslight District and Knights of Guinevere, and has recently partnered up with LackaDaisy to help fund it into a full series, thus technically making it a Glitch show. Now, Glitch Productions has had a super well respected fan base, saying how they become a beacon of hope in animation, especially since other giants like Disney and Warner Bros. Have not been treating animation the best in the last few years. However, despite all that, there's been a question that myself and many others have been concerned about, especially with the more recent decisions that Glitch Productions has been making. That being, is Glitch gaining too much power in the indie space? Or in other words, has Glitch Productions become a monopoly? Now, this is not going to be a video bashing Glitch Productions or framing them as this greedy company like how Vinimoff does in like every video that he makes against the company, especially since I really like both Murder Jones and the amazing digital Circus, and I am excited to see what comes from this company. However, this video instead will be answering the question of if Glitch has too much power in the indie space, and also the criticisms I have for having that much power, or criticisms I have for people claiming that Glitch has too much power. So before we begin, please like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out with making these types of videos, and if you want to support me more on the channel, there are also channel memberships, so I consider joining them if you want to support me more. So let's begin. Now first, I think we should learn what the term monopoly is, because constantly a monopoly, or anything, without knowing what the word actually means is pretty dumb in my opinion. Now, as someone who took A push last year, I can successfully recall stuff from periods 6 and 7. No, that was not intentional. Which one aspect they mentioned is the industrialization of the United States during the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Now, this industrialization was due to the insane growth of technology, and soon, people took advantage of the system, which spawned many monopolies across the United States, which were basically these companies creating a space in a certain category that made it almost impossible for other companies to compete in. Some examples include Rockefeller Standard Oil, which owned about 90% of US oil at its peak, or Carnegie Steel Company, which became super popular, especially as skyscrapers and other construction projects were becoming really common, or Vanderbilt railroad industry, which expanded greatly as more people began to move to the western states like California, Washington, and Oregon. And monopolies are not a thing of the past. Even today, we have giant monopolies like Netflix and Google dominating the spaces they're in. There's also a reason why a website like YouTube is still popular despite the terrible changes they've been making over the years. They're just so dominant in the space that no competitor can even compete with them. So with that history lesson out of the way, let's look at Glitch Productions and see if they fit the same categories that these monopolies fit, as well as look at some of the reasons that people say they are a monopoly or have too much power in the indie space. Now, one of the first things I see people mention is a deal with Amazon, which is something that people do not like, as they tend to say that this causes Glitch to no longer be an indie studio, as well as having an advantage over the indie animation community because of being supported by a massive corporation. Thus, they no longer have to have the financial burdens that most other indie creators have. Now, for the part that they are no longer indie for being funded by a bigger entity, if that is enough to no longer make you an indie studio, then they would have lost their indie status as far back as when they were making Metarunner and Sunshine Paradise, since at the time, they were being funded by the Australian government to make those shows. So that claim is super weak. And no, don't say that Amazon is more powerful than the government, which by the way, is the same government that has this beautiful idea to ban social media for everyone under the age of 16, including YouTube, as well as sped age verifications across the country. If you really think that, then I'm sorry, but you're wrong. Now, for the claim that they have an advantage over the indie community for no longer having the financial burdens that most indie teams have, well, yes, that does make some sense, but it's not like they're the only one who's done this. One example is SolarBalls, another indie cartoon owned by Now Creatives, who's had the show recently added on Amazon Prime as well. And while they didn't say anything about them being funded by Amazon, I honestly won't be surprised if Now Creatives or Alva has at least made a deal with Amazon to help fund their shows. And that's just one example. Other shows like BFDI and the shows owned by Spingo Horse have also received massive funding from outside sources. Also, Glitch still has creative control over their shows. It's not like Hazbin Hotel where the show was completely changed to fit Amazon standards. I know this part has really little to do with if they're a monopoly, but I did want to mention this part because I feel like people would use this as a defense when they're asked why Glitch is considered a monopoly. However, another and one of the main reasons why Glitch is now being called a monopoly is because of the recent deal with LackaDaisy. If you're unaware, Glitch recently made a deal with LackaDaisy that they will help fund the show, adding more minutes and episodes. Many people say this is Glitch acquiring other shows, thus increasing the power, with people feeling that every major indie animation show would just be a Glitch production. Now first, while it's true that LackaDaisy is receiving funds, the idea that they are now considered an indie show of Glitch is kind of debated. I mean, Glitch is framing it in a way that LackaDaisy is now an indie production of Glitch Productions, but LackaDaisy still has creative control over their show. It's not like Glitch is now making all the decisions now, thus destroying the original vision. Also, Glitch was already helping LackaDaisy with merch sales, so it's not like their first time helping LackaDaisy with their show. Now, I think what is going to define if LackaDaisy is going to be a Glitch production or not, or at least in my opinion, it's going to be based on whenever the episodes are going to be uploaded on the LackaDaisy channel or on Glitch's channel, as well as what the pay is going to be, which is either going to be all towards LackaDaisy or split between Glitch Productions and the LackaDaisy team. Now, these are just guesses, and these are stuff I do not have any information of, so take all these claims with a grain of salt. Now, with some of those claims out of the way, do I think Glitch Productions is a monopoly? No. Based on the information, Glitch isn't trying to actively make it harder for other indie animations to succeed, or nor buying up all the indie shows just to change them. You could possibly agree that Glitch funding LackaDaisy makes them somewhat of a monopoly, as they are now having some control over more indie shows, but also at the same time, you can easily make the claim that this is something a monopoly would not want to do. So realistically, it depends on your opinion. Another thing is that the work environment of Glitch Productions is super good, which, at least in the late 19th century, was not one of the top priorities for these companies. However, just because I don't consider Glitch Productions a monopoly doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned about their rise. Now let me explain. While it is nice to have a company like Glitch Productions succeed, especially in a space that is dominated by companies that don't respect animation, I don't want them to have too much power. Or in other words, I don't want the indie animation community to turn into a space where all the most popular shows are owned by the same company, as in my opinion, that completely ruins the whole idea of indie animation. Now I'm not saying this is where we are right now, far from it, as we have other big shows that aren't owned by Glitch like BFDI, Catching Up, SolarBalls, and let's not forget the elephants in the room, Alan Becker and Spindlehorse, which are both just as big as Glitch Productions, and have gotten as many views as they have gotten. But I don't know, knowing that around half the most popular indie shows are owned, or at least supported by Glitch in some way, doesn't really sit right with me, and it concerns me that this might get worse in the future. Now I'm not going to say this will lead the indie shows to have a harder time growing in YouTube. I mean, if anything, I think Glitch Productions, especially with the release of the Imagine Digital Circus, is the reason why indie animation has gotten as big as they did. However, when look at the views, sure, many of these indie animation shows are getting millions of views per video, with some even passing 10 million views, but when it comes to Glitch's shows, an average Murder Drone show has around 30 to 40 million views, with an Imagine Digital Circus episode gaining around 80 to 110 million views, and even other shows like The Knights of Genevive or Gaslight District, while not nearly as successful, have still managed to get both of the pilots passing 15 million views, because outside of Alan Becker, Spindlehorse's shows, BFDI, and Skibbity Toilet, no other indie show gets these numbers constantly. Some of you are probably wondering why Glitch Productions is specifically being framed for as a monopoly, especially since other indie animation companies do exist. It's because of how fast they grew. You see, as large as both Alan Becker and Spindlehorse are, they've been in the indie space for over 5 years at this point, and while Glitch has existed around that time as well, it wasn't until the Imagine Digital Circus where they got super big. I mean, they went from going from a normal indie studio to arguably one of the most successful ones in the entire community, which is something they have achieved in the span of a few years, and thus people see this as a reason why Glitch is a monopoly. And I think them funding LackaDaisy has only made people more freaked out, and has also led them to have at least some more power in the indie space, especially since LackaDaisy was one of the popular shows that wasn't owned by Glitch or Spindlehorse. And I'm not saying the decision they made with LackaDaisy is bad, far from it. I mean, LackaDaisy basically had a show that had 55 total minutes across 5 episodes, and were offered to be funded by a larger company to not only double the length of the episodes, but also add one more with that doubled length. I mean, if I had a show that I desperately wanted to make and was offered that deal, I would take it, especially since LackaDaisy was already having funding issues, because despite raising over $2 million, because of how high quality the animation was, it makes sense that this $2 million would only be enough to have an hour-long series. So I'm happy that this deal was made, and I'm very excited to see what comes for the show. And I also don't think Glitch's intention to fund LackaDaisy was to have more power over the indie space. I think their main goal was just to help a friend out. So while this deal was pretty good, it does worry me that Glitch is going to start having more power, especially if they consider LackaDaisy as a Glitch production. Another issue that could arise from this is having a huge wave of people trying to make indie shows wanting Glitch to fund them instead of earning money on their own, which will either lead to many indie pilots showing up but failing, or many people not wanting to make indie shows because Glitch wouldn't fund them, thus losing a lot of potential in the indie space, which by the way isn't Glitch's fault. Yes, animation is expensive, but you can't just make an ambitious animation project and expect someone like Glitch to fund them, because Glitch, as big as they are, they can't afford to fund every single person in their shows. I mean, Monkey Wrench had wanted to be funded by Glitch multiple times, and they asked them, but Glitch denied it, so it's not like they can fund as many shows as they want. If you have an idea for an indie show and it's going to involve a lot of money, either A, find another method to fund your show, B, wait a few years and slowly save money, or C, start things small and make things on your own in order to cut the cost. However, this last thing is going to be really hard to do unless you're really talented, have a lot of free time, motivation, and you know what you're doing. So yeah, while it is false, and in my opinion kinda dumb to consider Glitch Productions a monopoly, that doesn't mean we should ignore how dominant they are, or completely deny the reasons why people think they are a monopoly, especially because of how popular they've gotten in the YouTube indie space. And while I am hopeful that Glitch can compete with companies like Disney in the future, I really don't want all all the popular indie shows on YouTube to just be owned by Glitch. Now let's say Glitch does continue to get bigger. Is there any way to avoid this? Yeah, that being to support other indie shows. There are many good indie shows that exist on YouTube that are not owned by Glitch. I already mentioned a bunch in this video like SolarBalls, BFDI, Catching Up, and Monkey Wrench, and there's probably many more that I haven't mentioned. And you might think, Red Saturn, I'm only one person. I can't make a difference. Based on the way the YouTube algorithm works, I think it is possible. And also, viewing the shows isn't the only way you can support them. You can also support them by buying their merch or spreading the word to other people, which can hopefully lead to these other indie shows to grow big as well. Now, I know my opinions are not really clear in this video, especially since I'm basically talking about how Glitch is becoming too dominant in the indie space and how it's winning for indie animation, especially with their power and funding of other shows, while also defending them and not being a monopoly, and talk about why it's good that Glitch is funding LackaDaisy and how they benefit the indie space. But in case some of you are unclear about what I'm trying to say, I don't hate the idea of Glitch helping other indie shows, as well as how popular they've gotten. I just don't want to have the indie space that all the most popular shows are just Glitch Productions or funded by Glitch. I want other studios to rise as well and be just as successful as Glitch Productions, because I don't want to live in a future where it's just Glitch versus the big animation studios, but instead indie animation as a whole versus the big studios, because when that's the case, that's really when the big studios will need to start trying if they want to compete with these indie studios. You know, now that I think about it, I think this is already happening. Zootopia 2 recently released and it became really well received by critics and audiences, which is actually pretty surprising, especially since a lot of their other sequels have tended to be poorly received due to how poorly written they are. And while this is crazy, it could be because of how fast Glitch Productions is rising and Disney having some concern that Glitch could overtake them soon, so they're making good movies in order for them to stay afloat. Or it could be because of how much fun the writers have of making Zootopia 2. I haven't seen the movie, but I really do want to. Also, one more thing, this is somewhat off topic, but how does Michael Kovac handle all these voice acting roles in indie shows? Like, I'm pretty sure he's a voice actor in like 5 shows, with most of them currently running, so how does he do it? But anyway, what do you think? Do you think Glitch Productions is a monopoly or not? Do you think they have too much power in the indie animation space? And is there anything in this video that you disagree with? Let me know in the comments below. Well, if you made this far into the video, thank you so much. This is probably going to be one of the longest videos on the channel, so I really hope it does well. Thanks for watching this video, please subscribe for more content like this, and I'll see you guys later.